My name is Ahmed Akasha. I am a graphic designer stroke creative director by day, and I'm a multidisciplinary artist by night. For today, I'm very much wearing my graphic designer hat, and I'm going to talk you through the ideas that one should consider when they're creating any sort of artwork for podcasting. I'm going to show you something just before I start, and I'm just going to say very quickly, look at this slide and tell me which of these you are drawn to. You can shout. The cone. And it's just so obvious. But do you know why you're so attracted to it?
It's a clean sleeve.
Well, you might as well just come here and do this. But it's that thing. I think we're fairly sophisticated in our understanding of design these days, but it's often subconscious. So we may not actually understand why we are drawn to things, but we know what's good design and we know what's bad design instinctively. It's really important to get that first impression right. And if we go to the next slide. Now, podcasting is, for the last 10 years, has become a revelation. I think it's worth between 40 to 50 billion in the last year, which is a sizable amount of money. But there's approximately 6.5 registered podcasts. About 4.5 of those are actually active. So it is not necessarily an easy space to get into. There's a lot of competition, and whatever idea you may have, if you look, there might be something out there that may not be the same as your idea, but somewhere in that ballpark. And I say this to say that actually it's really important to think about first impressions. And it's really important to think about first impressions when about 70% of people get to experiment, or I should say discover podcasts through the apps. I think about 71% of people find them through social media. This is why everyone's trying to be viral, because if you can go viral, then all of a sudden people will click and then say, oh, let me find out more about that podcast. But in the event that you aren't going viral, a lot of people are going into the apps and thinking, well, today I actually want to listen to something to do with finance. And so they will click through, they may look at the chart, they may not look at the chart. But the point is, a lot of people are discovering podcasts through apps and not necessarily just through the viral sensation moments that people seek. And so that puts you in this, in a kind of an advantageous position, because you could say, well, how do I make the most of that? How can I create something that attracts attention? And so there's some studies around this, and they say that, for example, people make a decision on 3 seconds. So they'll look at any cover for 3 seconds and make a decision as to whether they would want to listen to this or not. And if you think about it, it's not a lot of time. It might even be less. If you think about your own use of social media or your own use of the apps, and you kind of go scroll through, if you kind of just step outside your body and think about how you use your phone when you're scrolling through things, and think about what makes you stop and think, oh, that looks interesting. It's just worth noting in your mind, what is it that's connecting with you? With that said, different things connect with different people depending on their own interest. First impression is important. Before I do anything to do with design, I just want to say something. Graphic design will not make your podcast. And I say this even though I am a graphic designer and this is my job to create things that communicate well. But really, the core of your idea has to be good. You have to really think about what it is that you want to create with your podcast. You have to think about who that audience is and what are they expecting, what are they looking for. So you have to have that balance between having a very clear idea about what it is that you're trying to create, as well as what the audience looks like out there and what they are interested in. It's not enough to say, well, I am interested in this, and so therefore I'm going to create a podcast going to sit down, I'm going to talk all day, I'm going to put it out in the world. You don't know who you're putting it out to. So if it's just a hobby and you just want to do it for that sake, then you can do that. But if you're doing it with the aim of having people listening to your podcast, you really need to drill down and understand who's going to be listening to that podcast. And the reason why that's important is because only when you understand who the audiences are, can you then design for that audience. Otherwise, you're designing into the ether, and that's never going to work. So it's really, really important to understand your audience. And if you are also stepping into a world where, let's say you're doing a football podcast, there is a million football podcasts. You have to develop a USP within that stands out. Once you get all of these things clarified in your head, you can then move into design. But without that level of clarity, it's difficult to design anything that responds to what the core of your idea is. So I'd say that's the first thing to do. It's really, really important. And I kind of have this kind of conversation with clients all the time and say, have great clarity in terms of what you're trying to achieve. And then you can really then look into good design that will communicate your idea effectively. The two are married. Without they have to coexist. One without the other doesn't work. If you have a very good podcast and you communicate that really poorly, you're also likely to fail. You may not fail, you may actually do well, because there are examples of podcasts that have done really, really well with poor communication, let's say, of just their cover art. Let's just really be honest. But there are other reasons why they got to where they are. So it's not having poor design isn't going to maybe break your podcast, but it will definitely impact your ability to gain new audiences, because, as I said before, we're quite sophisticated. And so if you see something that doesn't look great, mentally it may be a reflection on the quality of the product, and you make that kind of association because you think, well, if it's such a good podcast, why would it look like this? It doesn't. The two don't work together. So you think, there would be some effort that's gone into the making of the communication for the podcast as well as the podcast. So once you've done all of that, think of names. Names are also quite important because they also affect the design of your podcast. Now, there's few types of names that people usually go for. There's functional names, something like Guardian Football Weekly, very functional. It does what it says on the tin. It is what it is. A lot of other podcasts will go for a pun or something quite humorous. They will take something like Sod's Law, and it will be Sam's Law or something like that. Something where you're taking something that's well known, like Birds of a Feather. They will change it into something else and change one word and have it rhyme. And so then all of a sudden you've got something that feels memorable, something that feels familiar, and you want it to be memorable because you may see this somewhere. You may see a clip, you may be like, oh, that really sounds interesting. You may go home and think, what did I just watch earlier? What was the name of that podcast? Have I saved it? But if it's a memorable name, it will stick. So naming is actually quite really vital. It's quite vital in getting your communication off to a good foot or a good footing. Consider if you need a logo. And that's quite important because lots of people start podcasts and they think of the podcast, and then later on this podcast becomes successful, and then all of a sudden it becomes a brand. And then you're thinking about things like, what does the website look like? What do we have merchandise? Are we doing a tour? Are we doing, other bits of communication? And so if you've designed a cover for your podcast solely to do that job, but later on you need to expand, you may end up in a situation where you're having to retrofit some design. And I show this, the Joe Rogan Experience, which is probably one of the most listened to and watched podcasts in the world. But if you see what's on the left, that's the original design that's been around since I think the show ever started. But it isn't necessarily a logo. It's a graphic with his face and the name around. And so when you look at the show, you can see that they've actually created another logo that works as a logo with the name in neon lights underneath the show, because that one wouldn't work as well. So they've kept it because everyone's familiar with it. You've got millions of people who are listening to it. No need to change it. It does what it needs to do. But there's an understanding that doesn't quite work as a logo. And so sometimes people are having to do this retrofit. The other two I show because they actually both look like graphics. But if you were to extract the text out of those, you can kind of see the logo element, if you will. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a logo that has to stand still and here's the logo, here's the rest of the podcast name, not at all. But if you take out Pod Save the World, then that could be clearly a logo on its own, on a t-shirt if you want, or whatever you need it to be. So that's actually quite important to think about just in terms of future-proofing your journey into podcasting. Next, this really applies to any piece of communication that you do in the world. Anything to do with whether it's flyers, whether it's reports, just any piece of graphic design, there are principles that you should always consider. And so beyond the cover of your podcast, always think about these things. And it's really important as well, because if you're actually communicating with designers, it's always good and refreshing for a designer to have conversations with people who actually understand what's being done here. So hierarchy is something that's really, really important, because if you have hierarchy, you understand what you want people to see first when they look at any piece of graphical information, what you want them to see next, and what you want them to see third and fourth. So it's almost like the eyes are doing a journey around the screen, and you have to have that clarity of where you want the eyes to land and where you want it to go next and where you want it to go next. If you don't have that clear understanding of hierarchy, what you will do is you will have competing elements where people are looking here and are looking there. And I show these two examples because you'll see a very clear hierarchy on the right, and you will see competing elements on the left. You'll see also a level of simplicity on the right, and you'll see, and I feel really bad about singling this out because it does exist in the world. So I apologize, whoever's podcast this is. But yeah, it could just do with some tightening up, because I'm imagining most of you your eyes will land either on the face or on the shit hot next to it. And then you have a decision to make whether to go to top, whether you go to left. It's quite a confusing, thing to look at. There isn't real clarity. Whereas with this, it's very clear. You start at the top and you go down, and the hierarchy is very clear, and the simplicity also allows for you to understand what's being said. And there's only two words here, whereas you have, again, naming is important. The simple guide to looking shit hot, the podcast for busy professional men, and then the name of the individual. That's a lot. That's an essay. Whereas on the right, you only have two words, name of the podcast. You have these three words that act as information or kind of some sort of strapline, but they're actually not that important. If you read them, you read them. If you don't, you don't. But at least you have that clarity, and you have also really great contrast. Whereas on the left, I'd say the brown on the blue is poor contrast, and it doesn't work as well as the pink on the yellow. So again, contrast is really, really important. Consistency as well. You don't necessarily want to have 5 fonts on such a small piece of art. It feels all over the place. Whereas having 2, maximum of 3 feels just about right. And then on terms of consistency, also think about the way in which your podcast artwork will be displayed across different mediums. So you need to think of that consistency. It's not just going to live in one podcast app. It will live in many podcast apps. It will live on a website. It may live on YouTube, of course, Instagram stories, TikTok. So you need to find a kind of a suite of artwork that's consistent, where the hierarchy of information is very similar. That's all very important. Now, all of those things, and I've just kind of whizzed through them, they're really important. But at the same time, what's really, really important is also to allow yourself to be disruptive if you want. And what do I mean by that? I mean, just because everyone does something in one way doesn't stop you from trying to experiment or to push boundaries. That's always there for you. But as long as you actually are aware that you're trying to push the boundary and you have the reasons for that act, it's not good if you are trying to do something where you are doing wellness and your podcast is about wellness and it's a very safe within the space of wellness, but you're pushing boundaries on the artwork for no reason. However, if you have a radical wellness podcast that deals with wellness through, I don't know, the framing of anti-capitalism or something, then the artwork could be disruptive to look at wellness through that prism. So the two are in harmony, and the artwork is trying to communicate the idea of the podcast. So design, I say, is always about balance. There's always two things or three things or four things to consider. It's not just one thing, and you don't have to kind of just think, okay, I need to do this. No, you have to think about your audience. You have to think about what the podcast's about. You have to think about all of these principles, and then you have to kind of make a choice of where you want to push and where you want to pull. And then some general rules in terms of podcast design. This happens a lot. People design on really nice big screens, 30-inch, and then they never test it on a mobile. And not only do they not test it on a mobile, they don't test it on an app in a mobile. And so you're dealing with something that looks great when it's this big on a screen, but you can't read it when it's 1 centimeter across on your app device. So context is always key. Things can look good in one particular environment, but don't look the same in another environment. So you have to design with the environment in mind. So for example, top left, you have 4 words that are just illegible. Like you just can't see them on the corners. But if this was twice the size, you can read them very clearly. So again, they are lost to the point where they probably don't need to be there. Again, we talked about contrast, you know, really, really bad here. This one here, you've got an essay again. No one's ever going to be able to read that, so there's just no point. You've done a lot of hard work. You've got the podcast like kind of nice and big, and it's very legible. And then you've added lots of things that are just illegible, and there's no need for that. And the other thing that you might want to avoid is having these, trying to find a kind word for them, but I think graphic design has been democratized to a large extent. People can just go online, go to Canva, pull up something, type, and off you go. But what you end up with is things that are derivatives of one another, and there's no originality. It's just stock imagery, stock graphics, and so there's no personality. And so you want to avoid that as much as possible, especially when there's temptation to just do things, you know, for next to nothing. And there's, you know, if you're bootstrapping, that's absolutely understandable. But the problem with bootstrapping sometimes is that you may end up in a situation where you say, well, I'll use an AI tool to create something. That's always going to be a derivative of something else. And so think about how you can be original and not just a derivative of some other design. Element of design is color theory. Color theory does a lot of hard work for us in a way that we just don't really understand, or we don't think about enough. You'll often see anything to do with wellness in that green space. And we've come to understand it as a synonymous with the idea of health. Or you'll see it with yellow as well, because there is happiness and joy in yellow. So what happens is we get locked into this frame of understanding, and now you come along and you're trying to do something in that space. What do? That you've got 2 ways. You can either adapt and adopt those colors and say, right, well, actually, these colors signify this understanding from a psychological point of view, and thereafter from a market point of view, because every other podcast in this world has used these colors. And so those colors have come to signify X. In the same way with typography, they've come to signify X. And so you can then make a decision or an informed decision and say, well, do I stick within that color framework or do I actually pull out a little bit? And you have to be careful, because the other side to this is, again, let's say you're doing something in wellness. Do you use red? Probably not, because that's energy, that's high energy. And maybe you're dealing with something that wants to bring calm to people. So it's not good enough to say, I'm going to pull out of that space into another space if you don't have a clear understanding of where you're going. Back to context, that's all well and good. However, different cultures view colors very differently. And so going back to your audience, you have to understand who your audience are, because color perception can really be different from one society to another. And so often when we do these things, we always think of it from a Western perspective. A lot of design, unfortunately, is through this Western perspective and Western understanding. But actually, there's a whole big wide world out there. And so it's always worth considering what colors mean in other cultures, especially if your podcast is in any way reaching out to those other cultures. Different cultures take different colors to mean different things. There are things that are consistent throughout, like gold. You know, gold has an association with royalty and affluence, etc. So that you will find certain colors that are consistent and mean the same things. Royalty in this country, I think, is purple. I think in some other countries is purple as well. But actually the other day I was watching something, I can't remember, but in Japan it's something else. I don't want to say it out loud just in case it's wrong and it's just out on the internet. It's like, he said this and no. But essentially, no, because you could be aiming at a, I don't know, let's say a Asian market, and within it, or let's say in, I mean, Asia is a big, so probably not an Asian market, you wouldn't say that, but you say Middle East. You can kind of then start to look at frameworks. If you notice, a lot of regions share the same color of flags, because there's an understanding of what those colors mean in those regions. And that's a shared understanding. So you'll see Pan-African colors, you'll see West African countries share colors like yellow, red, green. You'll see Pan-Arab colors, they'll use what essentially is the Palestinian flag, those colors in different ways. I think only Qatar steps out of that, but the green, the red, the white, and the black. You go over to Central America, blue, red, white features heavily. So it's just interesting how you can kind of see that clear culture and color relationship exists in the world. But yeah, it's a good question, but I think you just have to do some research and kind of make a decision as to who the audience are. And if you just truly are going out for a global audience, then you're going to make decisions with a kind of educated guess as to, you know, what it's going to look like look in the world. But the reason why I go back to the audience thing is because it's not always good to aim at everyone, because it's impossible to aim at everyone. Once you get to the point where you have considered all of this, there's really three main routes that people usually take in designing covers. They don't have to be kind of single entity, they can be mixed and matched. So you can have strong typography with an image led cover, you can have just typography, or you can have illustration. You could have different types of illustration if you want. You can have painting, but it's essentially those are the three big categories, and they tend to work well for different types of things. Where you have someone who is famous, 90% of the time, you're going to go with an image led because it's the recognizability factor. It's really big. It's the same trick as when you go to a bookstore and you see the names of the author really big on the book and the title is really small. It's because the author is going to sell the book, the title is not going to sell the book. So it's the same thing. So again, if the host is famous, you're probably going to go with an image. If you're doing something where it's focused on you and your personality, if you're a comedian, if you are someone who has a kind of a larger than life personality and the podcast revolves around your life, that's probably also a space where you would kind of present your likeness on the cover. Typography really works for many things. It could be anything from business to, depending on the type, you can kind of have different moods. You can have something serious, you can have something fun, you can have bubble fonts, you can have something that feels kind of human where it's handwritten and you kind of feel that it's not a kind of a mechanical thing. Illustrations, you can do anything with those. You can kind of have different types of illustration that reflect something serious or, or something really fun. So those are the three big buckets, but you can obviously mix and match to achieve what you want to achieve. And then the other thing to consider is if you're doing something that sits comfortably within a genre, and these three sit in kind of crime mystery, you can either lean into the graphical space, the kind of the visuals of that particular genre, and say, right, well, we'll take, something that feels with, kind of silhouette-y with lights, and it feels quite scary, it feels quite dark, something at night. It kind of lends itself into that horror, crime space. There's a knife in the A kind of hidden. You can do that. Or you can go all the way to the right, where actually you've pulled right away and you've done something that actually doesn't reference the genre. So you can make a decision based on how you are going to present your podcast within that genre, because not every podcast within a genre is the same. Some people take it from an academic point of view, some people may take it from a fun point of view, or kind of a less serious. Some people look at it as a kind of a storytelling exercise. So there's different ways, and that's where you can kind of understand that you're within this genre and there's an expectation. But also you might say, well, actually, if I do something that looks like it sits in that genre, when someone's looking for, if I'm really interested in mystery podcast, I see something that looks like it's a murder mystery, I'd be like, oh, that's a murder mystery. I can see that. I don't need to kind of, double check. It's an instant recognition. But you may not want that. You may say, right, well, actually, I want to appeal to a broader audience, and so I want to do something different. So it's just having that understanding that you can either go from a space of kind of comfort, like deep within the genre, or you can kind of pull yourself away out of the genre and experiment a little bit more. And so at the end, you've designed your podcast cover, or a few, I hope. Just think about this. Kind of be as objective as you can, and then ask yourself, what does this say? If I was to see it, if this wasn't my podcast cover, what would it tell me? How would I react to it? And just be as honest as you can, because having that level of objectivity is quite difficult. But if you ask those questions, maybe you'll get closer to it, because we all have a subjective relationship with the things that we create. But if you try to step away and ask those questions, does it reflect the tone of the podcast or the quality of the content? And is it something that invites people to listen, or does it just look like every other thing that's out there? Finally, some tips. Use a graphic designer. No, I would say that. But in all seriousness, you're going to get much better results dealing with someone who understands design. If you can't, find a graphic designer that's local to you and you want to use any of the websites that exist where there are graphic designers all over the world, that's also an option. But I think that's always your first option. Go and use someone who understands and they've done some work in this particular space. You'll get much better results. If you can't, then there is Canva and there are other many free tools out there. I'd say test. The onlypod.com is really good because whatever you create, you can go on there and you can kind of see your artwork on every possible app that you can imagine. So it gives you a screenshot of what it would look like within Spotify, within Apple. What would it look like in, podcast apps, and you'll always have an understanding of what's working, what's not. So that's really important. Ask people for feedback. Ask people who you trust the opinion of. Don't take everyone's opinion because everyone's going to have a different opinion, but it's always good to get some feedback before you put it out into the world. Just see what people's responses are. You may not have considered something, that's really simple, and that often happens. Again, if you're a committee of one or two, you may have forgotten to do something. So it's just worth kind of expanding to a few people and getting their feedback. And then, keep your branding consistent across all social media. That's really, really important, because if you've done the hard work and you've created something that's good, what you want is recognizability factor. So you want people to just at a glance understand, oh, that's that podcast. It's really important because you've done all that hard work so that it becomes memorable, it becomes recognizable. So then if you start to actually design different things in different social media platforms, you've actually shot yourself in the foot because you've done all the hard work here and then you've gone and started something else somewhere else. So you want to be as consistent as possible. Consistency is really, really your friend. Any questions?